Hello there. So, welcome Shilakshmi and Akshata. This is the lesson on the post-human and the Anthropocene for week 7. And the overall course is on posthumanism, as you know. And our specific agenda for today is to look at the intersection of interests between posthumanist ways of thinking and particularly environmentalism and what is being called the Anthropocene moment. So let's start with Shilakshmi with the idea, the genre, the thematic of the Anthropocene as expressed in fiction, uh, solar punk. And would you like to start off by telling us a line or two about the Becky Chambers fiction about this?
Yes, so Becky Chambers' Monk and Robert series consists of two books called A Psalm for the Wild Built and A Prayer for the Crowned Shy. So these were published in 2021 and 2022 respectively. These are very hopeful narratives which talk about not a very what to say disturbed world or a dystopic world, but they talk about human non-human interactions. In the novel, it is between a human and a robot called Moscap, a human a monk called Dex, and a robot called Moscap. So these interactions are very hopeful, and um, they give off very good vibes in the sense that they're just traveling along, selling tea and just discovering the world, so to speak. So what Solapunk does is Solapunk advocates these very hopeful ways of looking at the world. The world is not always lost. It's not just desolate or dystopic, but very it can be caught back in ways that if you interact better with the nature, if you use sustainable resources and stuff like that, the novels show how these interactions make the future better, in the sense that the future is not just dystopic. Future is not always bleak or desolate. It has hope. There is hope in the future, and the future can be uh, seen in a better light when you read these novels. So that's basically what Solar Punk does. So
So
self-sustainable
it's
modes
not
of living.
apocalyptic. It's
Not
not
apocalyptic,
apocalyptic,
not at all. Yes.
right? So it's not the end of the world scenario, and like you said,
Hmm.
it's some kind of sustainable narrative and about sustainable
Yes.
worlds and then, what you said, a different relationship with nature. Yeah. So the battle that you see of man versus nature is not so much visible in the solar punk. Akshata, would you like to respond to that and build on this when we talk about the Anthropocene's intersection with posthumanism?
Um, yeah, in the sense that a lot of post-humanist critiques of the Anthropocene point out that it often has a very cynical kind of edge to it. That a lot of times they are not able to imagine a different future because the Anthropocene seems like the end point of the narrative. Um, Also, in the sense that because the Anthropocene itself, the word itself comes from anthropos, meaning humankind or mankind, and a lot of representations of the Anthropocene, a lot of the stories we tell about the Anthropocene have to do with the agency of humankind and how they have transformed the planet. So I think a story like Becky Chambers' Psalm of the Wild Build, what it does is that it helps us to again see human beings in relation to non-human beings and to see them as being in a sort of embedded in a sort of wider network of beings.
Yeah, excellent. Yes. So there's no doubt that it is a different imagination of the future of the planet and of humanity. But it's also important and interesting to see that Becky Chambers and earlier works on ecotopias speak of sustainability of survival in terms of communities rather than individuals. And that this becomes important as a theme because you're not looking at the lone survivor walking through a desolate countryside, which would be McCarthy's The Road. Instead, you have communities not necessarily fighting it out. So let's talk briefly about the uh, survival, sustainability, and community theme. Sri Lakshmi, would you like to dwell upon that quickly?
Yes, sure. So, when we're talking about survival and sustainability themes, what we can see is that posthumanism is basically about mutual cooperation living and entanglements and entangled living and stuff like that. So, what you're looking at is the formation of a multi species community in which species system, in fact, does not work. A human is not the center of the community that we're looking at. We're looking at multi species communities where life forms evolve together and evolve alongside one another. In these texts, for example, we have Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, or Becky Chambers. In any of these texts, if you look at what they are advocating for, is a very shared space, shared community of living, there are where the human is no longer the center and life forms evolve together as and when possible. Yes, and competition is always rejected in favor of cooperation as well.
Yeah,
So
that's
yes.
interesting because rather than see human evolution as solely dependent upon competition, you're talking about cooperation and collectivization here, almost as though indicating that we need to rethink the foundations of human society. And this cooperation and collectivization, as you pointed out, Sri Lakshmi, is across species as well. Yeah, so Akshita, what do you have to say about this business of communities which are cutting across species, uh, which will, of course, modify how we see ourselves as in our experience of the world, which will be, broadly speaking, human subjectivity itself changing. But the centering of the community, would you like to respond to Sri Lakshmi and say something about this?
Yeah, a lot of theorists, again, post-human theorists who critique the idea of the Anthropocene, they also object to the very word Anthropocene because it centers humankind. And people like Stacey Alamo, Donna Haraway, all of them say that we need other stories that include other species, that we need to think of the Anthropocene always with multiple species. Um, and I think there are, this is not a new idea because if you look at indigenous authors like Linda Hogan, and if you look at some of her poetry, she looks at how humankind is always entangled with other species, not only in the present, like Sri Lakshmi said, but have co-evolved with them. That there are these ancient kinships, and some of her poems, like if you look at her poem Crossings, she actually it's like an enactment of a memory because she talks about the narrator talks about remembering a time when humankind and whales were related or they crossed each other in their paths of evolution. And this, in a sense, she calls it a clan of crossings, that it's a community that is built out of these evolutionary histories, out of these shared evolutionary paths. So I think that is one of the ways in which uh, authors respond to the idea of how do we go about trying to imagine a multi-species community.
Hmm. Except that, of course, the problem that people have raised about the Anthropocene is predicated on the idea that we cannot really visualize the world through another species' eyes because we can only have a vision or a perception determined by our cognitive abilities that have evolved over the millennia. And to suddenly switch between species is not really possible, nor is it perhaps desirable. But yes, the arrogance that makes us assume that we are the center of the planets, the center of the universe, the center of all life forms is interesting. And therefore, this shift towards the collective, which marks actually a major shift in the way we think about it. So, yeah, those are lovely points. And I was just thinking, and I will return here to Akshata, that in the case of post-human subjectivities, see coordinates that you have yourself outlined, that would be species identity, deep time, which is a big theme now, and planetary scale. Uh, you note the fact that we have as in the humans have for a longish period of time, um, foregrounded human agency. So, would you like to say something about these coordinates in terms of the post-human's intersection with the Anthropocene?
Um, yes, I think when the word Anthropocene, which emerges in scientific debates, when it arrives into humanities and cultural studies, one of the main questions that has been addressed is the question of scale. Because when you talk about the Anthropocene, we're talking about geological times and we're not talking about the human span of life. So that has been one of the major concerns: is how do you represent something that is in a different scale, that's in a scale that we cannot perceive, that we cannot sense. Um, and In that sense, there have been representations, like if you look at Edward Bertinsky's Anthropocene project, where he has these photographs of the Earth, and these are large frames, vast landscapes of the Earth being quarried, being mined, agriculture, and all of them try to emphasize how human agency in this accumulated form on this planetary scale, how it functions and how it leaves these marks on the Earth. But there have also been critiques of this kind of representation, like you said, that this kind of story of the Anthropocene only emphasizes human agency. And these photographs often are desolate landscapes that don't have any human beings inside of it, but the perspective is kind of outside of the Earth itself, and there are no non human agencies involved. So I think because posthumanism gives us this idea that individuals are not bounded, isolated subjects, but they're always entangled with and embedded in their environment. So I think that is a major contribution when it comes to posthumanism, helping us to read or reread the Anthropocene, is to think of the Anthropocene subject itself differently, not as removed and zooming out and away outside the planet, but to think of human beings and human agency as being in place, embedded within a place.
That's very neatly put. Yes. I was also thinking when just as you were speaking about Sri Lakshmi's project on Octavia Butler, which is not quite fiction about the Anthropocene per se, but it does call into question the centering of the human, particularly in the case of Butler, where the agency is not necessarily of earthbound non-humans, but extraterrestrial non-humans, which offers you a very different vision of the points that you are making. Sri Lakshmi, would you like to come to this via a little bit of your Octavia Butler reading and work?
Mm, yes. So I'd say, yes, the agency and power, uh, sex relations, gender, and everything is imagined in very different ways in Butler's text. So what we observe that, for example, if we talk about the extraterrestrial beings who communicate with each other via neurosensory inputs or things like that, the communication happens in a very different level. So I'm also thinking of someone like Leo Sixon's three-body problem also, where the extraterrestrial beings there, the Trisolaris people from Trisolaris, they don't know how to lie. So one of the first things that they're worried about the human beings is that they ask, "Oh, you lie. So how do you lie?" Is that something that they ask? So I think,
Does it come
and they say,
naturally?
"Yeah, does it come naturally?" So
Yes.
yes, so I was also yeah, since Akshita was talking about the Anthropocene and how the human, we can only see from our point of view and not from the point of view of the other species around. So yeah, I was just thinking about the three body problem. Yes, so we're looking at other species which sort of communicate in different ways and sort of imagine lives in very different ways that we ourselves are unable to think or imagine the scale of. So what was the question again?
Yeah, but the point is that in the case of Butler, she's not looking at relationality and subjectivity with other earthbound creatures.
Yes.
In the case of all others, we are thinking of post-human subjectivity as relationality, interconnectedness, but they're still earthbound. In the case of the
Hmm.
Butler narratives, you're looking at extraterrestrial, non-Earth species coming in. So that lends a further layer to questions of the post-human subject, doesn't it?
Yes, 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 it does. Uh, so, uh, so, ways of looking at, for example, race and sex and gender changes. So we're not just looking at, let's say, race in the sense of black or white or anything like
Mhm.
that. So we're looking at, it does not matter anymore. The ways we think
Yes.
about, yeah, race does not matter. So what matters is the humankind as a whole against another species which are going to conquer us. So I think if we think about the Anthropocene and climate change and global warming and everything on that
Mhm.
aspect, on that scale, then we might be able to, sort of react to it in a different scale, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Principally because the
Yeah.
matter of scale is of great concern.
Yes.
Geological scales, yes, the kind of divisions we have made, but also in this case, an entirely different scaling up of operations because it's interplanetary. It involves outer
Yes.
space as well. Yeah, so I want to return to Akshita's point about multi-species and questions of the non-human, and think in terms of text. You mentioned Bertinsky, but would you like to tell us a little more about any other text that the students who are enrolled for this course could read in terms of relational and embedded subjectivity? I know you're an interest in Nick Hayes' work, so would you like to tell us something about that?
Yes. So in the case, he does a graphic adaptation, a rewriting of Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and it's a graphic novel. And it's really interesting because as you read through the narrative in the graphic novel, we move from a more enlightenment view of the human subject towards a more post-human view. And
Mhm.
it's interesting that he uses the geography of the page itself to do this. So if in the beginning you have, the human the protagonist, the mariner, is in a lot of the early panels, he's alone in his panels and he has those very firm boundaries in place. But as we move through the text, you have other animals that swarm around his panels, that jut into it, that are kind of, he's tightly cramped into his panels with these marine animals who look him in the face. And if in the beginning he uses binoculars or he uses the lens on a rifle to look at other animals, but as he moves through the text, he is forced in a sense to acknowledge that they're looking back at him. And it's really interesting because Nick Hayes uses the grammar of the graphic novel itself. Because in some places these panels shatter, in some places these frames kind of get mixed up with other panels. So I think that's a very interesting way of showing us how this subjectivity is not isolated, it's not bounded, but it's always in a sense enmeshed with other subjectivities.
Yeah, that's a lovely text for this particular purpose. Maybe not as powerful as, say, Butler's fiction, because Butler does a lot more with, say, gender, which Nick Hayes does not do. And which brings us to the next big point in posthumanism's intersection with the Anthropocene, and that's the question of the corporeal identity. We have mentioned in passing Stacey Alimo and transcorporeality, so let's move to that one. And Alamo's argument about the transcorporeal subject, where, and you just mentioned it, Akshata, that human bodies are not bounded and they are actually relational. Um, some of it originates in the rather horrific storytelling that Butler does, uh, where, for example, I'm thinking of Bloodchild, which does a lot of this. The gender bending things that Ursula Le Guin does in The Left Hand of Darkness, all of which are built in one sense around bodies. So let's turn to Shilakshmi and ask her about the transcorporeality thing that you can use your own examples from your preferred text. Shilakshmi?
Yes. So if you're talking about how the body is imagined and reimagined in very
Hmm.
different ways throughout texts. So we have, so just mentioned blood child. So in blood child, what happens is there is an extraterrestrial species called the tlick, which lay their eggs in the body of human males, and that is all right, doesn't seem very gruesome, but the most gruesome part about it is when the eggs start coming out, they mature and they start coming out, and they just start eating out of the body, and they just crawl out of the body if not taken out in time. So that is a very gruesome depiction of how the body can be reimagined in uh, other than other than earthly spaces.
Yeah,
So
that's
yes.
one of the most frightening tales that you read, isn't it, Mr. Lakshmi?
Yes.
Practically in all of Butler, I think Bloodchild stands out. Also, I think novels like The Clay's Ark, where
Mm,
the
yes.
human body becomes transformed into an unidentifiable species, more or less. You're animal and
Yes.
human. You're not animal, not human. And I
Mm,
think the complication of the bodily, but in the case of Clay's Ark, of course, emotionally and intellectually as well, your urges and drives are different. Yeah, so
yes.
I think Bloodchild is a great example to begin with. I'll move back to Akshata now about the forms of knowing and gathering evidence which become a part of environmental justice movements, which are also built around questions of the transcorporeal. That, for example, toxins affect not just the human body, but also others. Would you like to talk about this briefly?
Yeah, Sri Lakshmi just mentioned, you also did that when you look at Blood Child, you have, you know, when you look at Clay's Ark, you have human beings who are transformed into something that is unrecognizable. And that is science fiction, but if you look at a novel like Ambika Sudan Mangat's Swarga, which talks
Mhm.
about real life incidents that happened in Kasargod district in Kerala, where endosulfan poisoning, that was pesticides sprayed on cashew nut plantations, and how they begin to affect human beings, but also everything else in that landscape. And a lot of times they talk about how human children, it causes very fast genetic mutations, and human children are born. And when you look at the novel, a lot of times these children are seen as not being human, that they don't look human at all, that in a sense they are being transformed. The subtitle of the English translation itself is a post-human tale. So it is about how, in a sense, endosulfan is messing with human bodies and transforming them into something that's unrecognizable. And the novel, like you said, when it comes to gathering scientific evidence, Stacey L.M. or others who theorize transcorporeality, they say that um, in today's time, when there are so many toxins that are so spread across the world, it becomes difficult to even understand yourself. So when these people they fall sick, it takes them a long time to understand that this is endosulfan that is causing it. And again, then there are these political questions of, do you have evidence for it? Do you have medical evidence? How do you prove that this is what is happening? And he depicts people who are struggling with that, because they're like scientists who should be looking at it are keeping silent, or they're forging documents. And how then do they go about proving that this is what is causing it? It's a very difficult process to map which chemicals cause what. So that is something that he depicts very well, how citizens have to struggle with trying to understand and master scientific uh, ideas.
And yet, this scientific knowledge is a part of the post-human ethical stance that you should have a diagnosis of the problem. You should have alternatives, which is why, if you go back to the early text that you mentioned, the Becky Chambers work, uh, it's interesting that it is not, Chambers is not advocating a return to the earth kind of argument. There is technology, there is a notion of an advanced civilization, and yet it is not the kind of technological utopia that the postmodernists were fond of, which means to say that they are not anti-technology when you speak about the return to the earth. There is new religion, of course, Earthseed in Butler. There is a group called the Gardeners in Margaret Atwood's the Mad Adam trilogy, which means to say that the post-human theme does talk about transcorporeality, which is interspecies, as Butler shows and Sri Lakshmi mentioned, and with technology, as both of you have highlighted, which brings us to the really major point about how human evolution is being remapped, and that would be the question or theme of co-becoming. So let's return to Sri Lakshmi about this theme of co-becoming, which is, of course, centerpiece to most of these theorists. Sri Lakshmi?
So I was thinking about how new knowledge systems are formed within these narratives as such. New knowledge systems that sort of incorporate not just a one way of looking at life, not just the preferences of one species or one partner species, but both human and non-human alike. So, for example, we have Earthseed, which is a religion called Earthseed in the parable of the sower and parable of the talents. So in Earthseed, what we have is it is advocating for partnerships across and beyond to reach the stars. Basically, just the motto of Earthseed is to scatter a humankind across the universe and to reach other worlds. So what we have is new knowledge systems that arise as such, and they extol sustainability. They extol technology. Of course, is of course necessary to reach the stars, so spaceships and the kind. And to expand the idea of companion species, also to include the idea of companion species as well, Donna Haraway's companion species, in order to form a new kind of multi-species community which thrives on partnerships and companionships. So, yeah.
Yes, so it is more or less co-becoming or becoming with, except that you're not looking at earthbound species alone. You're not looking at plants or animals alone. You're looking at all sorts of
Yes.
other life forms. Akshita, what do you have to say in response to Sri Lakshmi's points about this?
So when you think about companion species, I mean, Butler, of course, looks at interstellar communities and all of that. But when you think about companion species, it is also it's so simple to think about in the sense that it is what we eat that makes us. And one of the poets that I mentioned earlier, Linda Hogan, also has a poem called Inside, which is very interesting because she's playing with what is inside of the human and what is outside and what makes us flesh. That's how she starts the poem, and she talks about how deer meat becomes the hands that work, that it enables human labor. That swallowed grains enable human spirituality, and spirituality is something that we always think of as exclusive to humans. But I think it's very interesting because she talks about how it is these food grains that we eat that nourish us, that keep us alive, and that, in a sense, then participate in those spiritual acts that humankind performs. So I think that's one way of thinking about co-becoming is to think about how the human itself cannot survive without the non-human. That a biologist like Scott Gilbert, etc., they talked about how there is no biological individual, that you are alive only because you are dependent. You are dependent on other species just in order for you to be alive. So I think that's the most basic sense at which we can understand how we co-become with other species that we would not be but for other species.
Yeah, I'm sure we understand that very well. So I want to conclude with a question to both of you, and you can give me quick responses to that, whether this particular way of looking at the world in the post-humanist school of thought, particularly looking at the Anthropocene world, does it constitute a certain ethical stance? That is, I think, the way we can wind this up. First, Sri Lakshmi, and then over to you, Akshata. Sri Lakshmi,
So I didn't quite get the question.
does the post-humanist approach here to co-becoming, transcorporality, and of course the Anthropocene, does it represent a certain ethical stance?
Yes, because if you're thinking about the posthuman as genetically improved species, then what we're looking at is there is no longer a human, right? So we are
Mhm.
looking at entangled forms of livings, and then what happens to the human as such? What happens to life itself, I think, is something that needs to be thought of when we talk about multi-species companionships and living.
Yeah. So the idea of life itself as
Yes.
a more open-ended way of yes. Yeah. Yeah. Akshita, for final remarks on the question of this.
So what posthumanism um, gives to Anthropocene, if you look at them both together, is the idea of relationality. That we are so related because the Anthropocene tends to emphasize human agency as separate somehow. And what the posthuman does is that because it gives us this idea of relationality and entanglement, like Sri Lakshmi said, the ethics emerge out of those sites of entanglement and out of those sites of intersections. If I have a minute, if I can just give a quick example. If you look at Chris Jordan's Midway project, which in which he photographs these albatross birds in the middle of the North Pacific Ocean on an island that is far away from humanity, so far that these birds do not usually encounter human beings at all. But when he photographs them, these albatross chicks are dead because they've been fed plastic objects. And when he looks at these photographs, you see, caps of pens or bottle lids, stuff like that. The ordinary objects we use every day. And when you see them as the cause for the death of a bird, so far away from you, that in a sense, I think, sort of encapsulates what post-human ethics would be in the Anthropocene. That because we are relational and we are
Mhm.
always embedded in these relations, everything we do affects other species, and that then forces us to be accountable to them. So I think that's one way of thinking about ethics in post-human ethics in the Anthropocene.
We should be what people like Haraway will speak about as response and responsibility. Our response to the world is also a responsibility. Well, yes. Well, that was, I think, a wonderful conversation. We covered a whole lot of ground. So thank you, Sri Lakshmi and Akshata. I'll stop recording now.